The dust hung in the air like a curse over Dry Creek, settling on everything: the cracked earth, the withered corn stalks that stood in Arthur Bennett's fields like grave markers, the rusted machinery that hadn't turned soil in 2 seasons because there was no point in planting what the drought would kill before harvest. The sky was the color of old bone, cloudless and merciless, the sun beating down with the steady cruelty of something that had forgotten how to show mercy. Arthur stood on his porch at dawn, looking out at land that had belonged to his family for 3 generations, land that was now little more than a monument to failure and stubbornness in equal measure. He was 52 years old but looked older, his face weathered by wind and disappointment, his hands calloused and scarred from decades of work that had once felt purposeful, but now seemed increasingly futile. The farm was dying. Had been dying for years, really, the drought just accelerating what economic forces and changing times had already set in motion. His wife had left 4 years ago, tired of poverty and isolation, tired of watching dreams shrivel like crops without water, tired of a husband who couldn't let go of land that was slowly killing him. She'd gone to live with her sister in Phoenix, sending divorce papers that Arthur had signed without protest, because he understood that love couldn't survive on stubbornness alone, that sometimes caring about someone meant letting them escape the trap you'd chosen for yourself. The bank had sent another letter last week, final notice before foreclosure proceedings. Arthur had read it once, then used it to start a fire in the wood stove because at least that way it served some purpose. He had maybe $300 left in his account, not enough to save the farm, barely enough to eat for another month if he was careful. Certainly not enough to start over somewhere else, even if he'd been willing to abandon the only life he'd ever known. He went to the auction that Saturday, not because he needed to buy anything. He had nothing to buy with, but because the livestock auction in Dry Creek was one of the few places where people still gathered, where the community that was slowly dissolving still maintained some semblance of connection. The auction barn smelled of manure and hay and the particular sweat that came from animals in pens waiting to be sold, their fates determined by men with bidding cards and calculators who saw them as commodities rather than living creatures. Arthur sat in the back row of the bleachers, watching farmers and ranchers bid on cattle and horses, the auctioneer's rhythmic chant filling the space with a sound that felt almost like music if you'd been raised around it. Most of the animals went for reasonable prices: good breeding stock, young horses with potential, cattle that would produce either meat or offspring, depending on what the buyer needed. But then they brought her out. The mare emerged from the back pen, led by 2 handlers who looked annoyed to be touching her, and the crowd's reaction was immediate. Laughter, scattered and cruel, the sound people made when something was so pathetic it became amusing rather than tragic. She was massive, a draft horse, probably a Percheron or Belgian based on her build, the kind of horse that should have been magnificent, powerful, capable of pulling weights that would break normal horses. But she was broken herself, skeletal to the point where her ribs showed like bars of a cage, her hip bones jutting at angles that looked painful, her coat dull and patchy, showing scars across her flanks that spoke of harsh treatment and harder living. But worse than the physical condition was her leg. The right front twisted at an angle that made walking look agonizing, each step a visible struggle, her head hanging low with the weight of pain and exhaustion and whatever suffering had brought her to this moment. Most people in that crowd saw a lost cause standing in the dirt. Arthur was about to see something else entirely. But before we find out what he does next, if you love stories about redemption and second chances, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Now, let's see what happened in that auction ring. Lot 47, the auctioneer announced, his voice lacking the enthusiasm he'd brought to previous animals. Draft mare, age unknown, obviously got some issues. Good for parts, maybe. We'll start the bidding at $10. Do I hear 10? Silence. The crowd had stopped laughing, uncomfortable now, because even hardened ranchers who saw animals as livestock rather than pets understood there were limits to how much suffering you should witness before it stopped being amusing and started being just sad. $10, folks. She's still got weight on her. Somebody give me 10. A man in the front row raised his card. Arthur recognized him, Jerome Walsh, the kill buyer who attended every auction, purchasing animals that were too old, too sick, too broken to be useful for anything except slaughter. He bought them cheap, transported them to rendering plants, made his profit from their deaths. It was a necessary business in agricultural communities, but nobody liked Jerome Walsh or wanted to acknowledge that his services were sometimes the most merciful option available. $10 to the gentleman in front. Do I hear 15? No response. Jerome smiled slightly, knowing he'd get her for bottom dollar, that this horse's remaining value was measured in pounds of meat and bone meal rather than anything she might contribute while still breathing. Arthur looked at the mare, and something happened that he couldn't quite explain even later when he tried. The horse lifted her head, slowly, painfully, the effort obvious, and her eyes found his across the crowded barn. They were brown and deep and carried an expression that Arthur had seen in his own mirror, too. Many times, the quiet, dignified sadness of a creature that had been broken by circumstances beyond its control but hadn't quite surrendered completely, that still retained some core of selfhood despite everything that had been done to diminish it. She looked at him. He looked at her. And Arthur recognized something familiar, something kindred, something that spoke to the part of him that understood what it meant to be used up and discarded and judged worthless by people who measured value in dollars and productivity rather than inherent dignity. 15, the auctioneer repeated, going once at $10. Arthur's hand went up. Not a conscious decision, not a rational choice, just his arm raising of its own accord, his body making commitments his mind hadn't authorized. $15 to the gentleman in back. Do I hear 20? Jerome Walsh turned in his seat, looking at Arthur with annoyance and confusion, who bid against a kill buyer on an animal this obviously destined for slaughter. It was like fighting over garbage, pointless and weird. $20, Jerome said, his voice flat. 25, Arthur heard himself say, and the number made him feel sick because $25 was his grocery budget for the week, was money he genuinely couldn't afford to spend on anything except food, certainly not on a broken draft horse that would need feeding and care and resources Arthur absolutely did not have. Jerome started to raise his card again, then stopped, studying Arthur with the calculation of someone who understood that sometimes people did stupid things for emotional reasons, and there was no profit in competing with stupidity. He shrugged and lowered his card, conceding, apparently deciding that $25 was already more than this horse was worth as meat. Sold to the gentleman in back for $25. Come settle up at the office. Arthur walked to the office in a daze, paid his $25 to the clerk, who looked at him with pity that made Arthur's face burn with shame, received the ownership papers that made this disaster officially his responsibility. The handlers brought the mare out to the parking lot, her lead rope extended like they didn't want to get too close, their expressions making clear they thought Arthur was either an idiot or a saint, and weren't sure which was worse. She's all yours, buddy. Good luck. You're gonna need it. They handed Arthur the rope and walked away quickly, like they feared stupidity might be contagious. Arthur stood there holding the lead, looking at this horse he'd just purchased for reasons he couldn't articulate, feeling the weight of one more bad decision, adding itself to the pile of bad decisions that had brought him to this point in his life. The mare stood with her head hanging, her twisted leg cocked to take weight off it, her breathing labored. Up close, she looked even worse. The scars on her flanks were deep, some old and healed, others more recent, telling a story of abuse that probably went back years. Her hooves were cracked and overgrown, her mane tangled with burrs, her eyes showing white around the edges in the way horses did when pain or fear had become their constant companions. Well, Arthur said quietly, more to himself than the horse, I guess we're both broke and used up and nobody wanted us. Might as well go home together. He started walking, and after a moment's hesitation, the mare followed, limping badly, each step looking like it cost her something. Arthur walked slowly to match her pace, not pulling or rushing, just maintaining steady forward progress toward his truck, parked at the far end of the lot. People watched from their vehicles, some shaking their heads, others looking away quickly like witnessing this particular brand of foolishness made them uncomfortable. The walk to his farm was only 2 miles, but Arthur didn't have a trailer and suspected the mare couldn't be loaded even if he did. She looked like she might collapse if stressed further. So, they walked. Along the highway shoulder, then down the dirt road that led to Arthur's property, the sun climbing higher, the heat becoming oppressive, both man and horse moving at the glacial pace that injury and exhaustion dictated. Arthur found himself talking to her as they walked, his voice low and continuous, saying things he hadn't said to another living creature in years, because isolation had made him forget how to communicate beyond the bare necessities. He told her about the farm, about the drought, about his wife leaving, about how the bank was taking everything. And maybe that was for the best, because at least then the decision would be made for him, and he could stop pretending he had choices left. The mare's ears swiveled toward his voice, tracking the sound, even though she couldn't possibly understand the words. But maybe she understood the tone, the particular loneliness that came from speaking into silence, the need to hear your own voice just to confirm you still existed, still mattered somehow, despite all evidence suggesting otherwise. They reached the farm as afternoon was giving way to evening, the sky beginning its slow fade from blue to gold to the purple that preceded darkness. Arthur led the mare to the old barn, barely standing, its roof patched with tarps. But it was shelter, and that would have to be enough. There was a stall that had once housed his father's horses decades ago, empty since then, except for storage and mice. But Arthur cleared it out quickly, spread the last of his hay on the floor, filled a bucket with water from the pump. The mare entered the stall slowly, sniffing, her nostrils flaring as she assessed this new environment. She drank deeply, the water disappearing in long, desperate swallows that suggested she'd been thirsty for longer than just today. Then she turned and looked at Arthur again, that same deep eye contact that had compelled him to bid in the first place. "I don't know what I'm doing," Arthur admitted to her. "I don't have money for feed, don't have money for a vet, don't even have enough for myself most days. But you looked at me and I looked at you, and I couldn't just let you go to slaughter when maybe there was something else possible." The mare lowered her head and exhaled, a sound that was almost like relief, like the simple fact of being in a stall with food and water, and a human who spoke gently was already an improvement over wherever she'd been before this. Arthur closed the stall door and stood there in the gathering dusk, looking at this horse he'd acquired for reasons he couldn't fully justify, feeling the weight of one more mouth to feed, one more responsibility he couldn't afford, one more connection to something that would probably end in disappointment, because that's how most things ended for Arthur Bennett. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, his farm didn't feel quite so empty. Didn't feel quite so much like a mausoleum where dreams went to die. There was life here now, damaged and broken maybe, but alive nonetheless. Breathing, present, real, that had to count for something. Arthur named her Duchess 3 days after bringing her home, watching how she carried herself, despite the pain and neglect. There was something regal in the way she held her head when she wasn't actively suffering, some core dignity that abuse hadn't managed to extinguish completely. She deserved a name that acknowledged that dignity, that recognized what she might have been before circumstances and cruel humans had broken her down to this skeletal, limping shadow. The first weeks were brutal in ways Arthur hadn't anticipated. His own hunger he could manage. He'd been poor before, knew how to stretch rice and beans and day-old bread into meals that kept you functional, if not satisfied. But watching Duchess eat the hay he couldn't really afford, seeing her need more than he could provide, that cut deeper than his own deprivation ever had. He got creative out of necessity, called in favors from neighboring farms, showing up to help with harvest or fence repair in exchange for hay that was moldy or weather-damaged. Not ideal horse feed, but better than nothing. He picked through the auction's discard pile for vegetables too bruised to sell, boiling them into mash that supplemented Duchess's diet with nutrients her body desperately needed. And every night, after whatever work he'd managed to find or create, Arthur would sit in Duchess's stall with a bucket of warm salt water, soaking her twisted leg, his hands gentle on the swollen joint, working the muscles that had atrophied from favoring the injury. He'd learned basic horse care from his father, who'd kept draft horses for farm work back when the place had been profitable, and while Arthur was no veterinarian, he understood enough to help if Duchess's body retained any capacity to heal itself. "Easy, girl," he'd murmur as she flinched from his touch, her pain threshold eroded by months or years of suffering without relief. "I know it hurts, but we're going to try. We're going to see if maybe you can get better, if maybe both of us can get better." The neighbors noticed, of course. Small towns didn't miss much, and Arthur's decision to rescue a broken horse had become something people discussed over coffee and in the feed store, their tones mixing amusement and pity, and the particular judgment that rural communities reserved for those who made choices that defied practical economic logic. Tom Henderson stopped his pickup one afternoon, while Arthur was in the field trying to coax some late-season growth from soil that was more dust than earth. Tom leaned out his window, his expression showing the strained patience of someone offering unwanted advice out of misguided obligation. "Arthur, I got to say, folks are talking. You're spending time and money on that horse when you can barely feed yourself. It's not healthy. That animal's never going to be useful. She's just a broken tractor taking up space and resources." Arthur straightened slowly, his back protesting, his hands covered in dirt that had once been fertile, but was now barely capable of sustaining anything. "Maybe, but she's alive. That counts for something." "Does it, though? I mean, realistically? You're going to lose this farm, Arthur. Bank's going to take it whether you've got a horse or not. At least as if you'd let Walsh buy her, you'd have had more grocery money." "Is there a point to this conversation, Tom? Or did you just stop to tell me I'm stupid? Because I already know that. Don't really need it confirmed by spectators." Tom's face reddened. "Just trying to help. Trying to get you to see sense before you make things worse than they already are." "Appreciate your concern," Arthur said, his tone making clear he didn't appreciate it at all. "But I made my choice. Duchess and I are figuring things out together. You're welcome to head on home now." Tom drove off, leaving Arthur standing in his dying field, feeling the familiar weight of being judged and found wanting by a community that had once been his support system, but had gradually transformed into an audience for his slow-motion failure. But something was changing with Duchess, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, but definitely changing. Her ribs began to disappear under a layer of healthy flesh, muscle building from the combination of decent nutrition and gentle exercise. Her coat lost its dull patchiness, beginning to show hints of the deep black it must have been before neglect had stolen its luster. And her leg, that twisted, painful leg that Jerome Walsh had marked as proof she was only good for slaughter, started straightening, the swelling reducing, the limp becoming less pronounced as whatever injury or strain had caused, it began healing under the influence of rest and care and Arthur's nightly soaking sessions. By the end of the first month, Duchess could walk without visible pain. By the end of the second month, she could trot, her massive body moving with coordination that had seemed impossible when Arthur first led her home from the auction. By the end of the third month, she looked like a different horse entirely. Powerful, muscular, her black coat gleaming in sunlight, her eyes bright and aware, her bearing suggesting strength that had been hidden under starvation and injury. Arthur would stand at the fence sometimes, just watching her, feeling something that might have been pride, or might have been hope, or might just have been satisfaction at seeing a living creature recover from circumstances that should have killed it. She'd proven everyone wrong. Tom Henderson, Jerome Walsh, the auctioneer who'd called her glue factory material. She'd proven that broken things could sometimes heal if given sufficient care and time, and the stubbornness to keep trying when trying seemed pointless. Arthur started thinking maybe he could recover too. Maybe the farm wasn't completely lost. Maybe there were options he hadn't considered because despair had made him stop looking for them. And then the flood came. The storm arrived without meaningful warning, just clouds building rapidly on a September afternoon when Arthur was trying to move his tractor to higher ground, sensing with the instinct that came from farming that weather was shifting and machinery needed protecting. The rain started as he was driving, light at first, then intensifying with shocking speed, the sky opening like it had been waiting for years to unleash this particular violence. The valley where Arthur's property sat had always been prone to flash floods when rain hit the mountains upstream, but the drought had made everyone forget, had lulled them into thinking water would never be a problem again after years of wishing for rain that never came. But this rain, this was different. This was months of precipitation condensed into hours. The dry creek that gave the town its name, transforming from a dusty depression into a raging torrent in what felt like minutes. Arthur saw the water coming, a wall of brown, moving fast, carrying debris and force that would destroy anything in its path. He accelerated, trying to reach higher ground, but the tractor's old engine couldn't generate speed sufficient to outrun water that moved like a living thing, hungry and unstoppable. The mud swallowed his wheels first. The ground that had been hard and dry for years suddenly transformed into soup that gripped like quicksand. Arthur felt the tractor slow, felt it tipping, tried to jump clear, but wasn't fast enough. The vehicle rolled, its weight crushing his right leg, pinning him as the water reached him, cold and relentless, rising with terrifying speed. Arthur screamed, but the roar of the flood drowned his voice completely. He was alone. The nearest neighbor was a mile away. Nobody would hear. Nobody would know he was here until the water receded and they found his body days later, crushed under a tractor on land the bank would claim, because Arthur wouldn't be around to contest the foreclosure. The water reached his chest, then his shoulders. The weight of the tractor made breathing difficult, each inhalation a struggle against crushing pressure and rising panic. Arthur could feel unconsciousness approaching, could feel his body starting to shut down from pain and cold and oxygen deprivation. This was how it ended, not with banks or auctions or gradual decline, but quickly, violently, drowned in a field that his family had worked for generations, killed by the same land he'd refused to abandon even when abandoning it would have saved him. The water reached his chin, and then he heard something, a sound that cut through the storm's roar, through the rushing water, through Arthur's fading consciousness. Hoofbeats. Duchess burst through the rising water like something from a myth, her massive body cutting through the flood with power that seemed impossible, even though Arthur had watched her transform over 3 months from skeletal wreck to this. A force of nature, all muscle and determination, her coat slick with rain, her eyes wild but focused. She'd kicked down her stall door. Arthur processed this dimly through pain and oxygen deprivation. That door had been solid wood, latched from the outside, and Duchess had simply destroyed it, choosing to confront the storm rather than wait in relative safety while her human drowned in a field. She waded toward him, her powerful legs fighting current that would have swept smaller animals away, her breath coming in great snorting exhales, her body leaning into the work of reaching Arthur before the water that was now at his chin could rise those final, fatal inches. "Duchess," Arthur managed, the word barely a whisper, using what little air remained in his compressed lungs. "Go back. Can't help. Get yourself safe." But Duchess had not broken down a door and charged through a flood to turn back now. She positioned herself beside the overturned tractor, her body creating a slight break in the current, her head lowering until she was close enough that Arthur could reach her. With hands that barely functioned, Arthur grabbed the chain from his belt, the tow chain he'd been planning to use to secure the tractor, now repurposed for salvation. He wrapped it around Duchess's neck, his fingers fumbling with clasps and links, knowing he had one chance to do this right because he was fading fast, and Duchess couldn't help if he couldn't help himself. "Pull," he said, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Pull, Duchess. Get me out." And she understood. Not the words, maybe, but the need, the urgency. The fact that her human was trapped and dying and required her strength in the same way she'd once required his care. Duchess dug her hooves into the muddy bank that was rapidly becoming more water than earth, her massive shoulders bunched. With muscle, her body leaning forward with effort that made Arthur's heart clench with fear that he was asking too much, that she'd hurt herself trying to move weight that was impossible to move. She groaned with exertion, a sound Arthur had never heard from any horse, deep and almost human, pure physical strain transformed into vocalization. Her hooves slipped, found purchase again, slipped more. The tractor wasn't budging, but Duchess didn't quit. She reset her stance, her breathing like a locomotive, steam rising from her body despite the cold rain. And she pulled again, harder this time. Something beyond normal effort, beyond what should have been possible, her body producing strength that went beyond physical capability into something else. Will, maybe, or loyalty, or just the stubborn refusal of a creature that had been written off as worthless to accept that sometimes you couldn't save what mattered. The tractor shifted. Just an inch. But an inch was enough to reduce pressure on Arthur's leg, to let him draw a fuller breath, to give him space to work his body toward freedom. Duchess pulled again, and the tractor shifted more, metal scraping against stone, the vehicle's weight momentarily overcome by sheer force applied by an animal that somehow knew exactly how much was required and how to deliver it. Arthur felt his leg come free, bone-deep pain that made his vision white out, but free nonetheless, no longer pinned, no longer trapped. He grabbed Duchess's lead with one hand, his other arm wrapping around her neck, and the horse began moving, dragging man and chain and the weight of near death back toward higher ground. She moved slowly, each step deliberate, her body compensating for Arthur's weight and his injured leg that couldn't support him, and the current that tried to tear them apart. She didn't rush, didn't panic, just kept moving with the patient determination of something that understood. Survival required steady progress rather than desperate speed. They reached the porch as Arthur's consciousness was fading, his body shutting down from trauma and cold and pain that his nervous system was struggling to process. Duchess stopped at the steps, lowering herself to her knees in a movement that allowed Arthur to slide from her back onto wood that was blessedly solid and stable. And then she stood over him, her body blocking the wind, her warmth radiating downward, keeping him conscious until the storm passed and neighbors could reach them and help could arrive. Arthur woke in the hospital 2 days later, his leg wrapped in a cast, his body attached to machines that beeped with the steady rhythm of continued existence. The doctor explained that he'd been lucky. The leg was broken but not shattered, the hypothermia severe but reversed before permanent damage occurred, the trauma significant but survivable. "Your horse saved your life," the doctor said, his tone suggesting he didn't quite believe what he was saying, even though the evidence was undeniable. "The neighbors found you on your porch with a draft horse standing guard over you like she was protecting you from predators. Most remarkable thing they'd ever seen." Arthur was released a week later, his leg still healing, his mobility limited but sufficient to manage basic farm tasks. He returned home, expecting to find Duchess in her stall, hopefully cared for by neighbors during his hospitalization, probably traumatized by the storm and the flood and the effort she'd expended saving him. But when he reached his property, a strange car was parked in his driveway, an expensive car, the kind that looked out of place on dirt roads in communities where most vehicles were trucks, held together by rust and prayer. A man stood at the fence watching Duchess graze, his posture showing the particular stillness of someone who'd found something they thought they'd lost forever. He was maybe 60, well-dressed in the casual way wealthy people dressed when visiting rural areas, his face showing emotions that Arthur couldn't quite read from this distance. "Can I help you?" Arthur called from his truck, his crutches making exit awkward. The man turned, his eyes wet with what might have been tears. "Is that your horse?" "Yes, sir. Name's Duchess. She's mine." "Do you know what she is?" Arthur felt defensive rising, unsure where this conversation was heading, but certain it wasn't going anywhere good. "She's a draft horse, Percheron probably. I bought her at auction 3 months back. She was in bad shape, but she's recovered now." "Her name isn't Duchess," the man said quietly, moving toward Arthur with steps that suggested he was approaching something sacred. "Her name is Midnight Queen. She's a champion Percheron from my breeding operation in Kentucky. She won the national draft horse pulling competition 2 years running. And then she was stolen from my farm 2 years ago. I've been looking for her ever since." The world tilted slightly, Arthur's understanding of reality requiring rapid adjustment. "Stolen?" "Taken during the night. We filed police reports, hired investigators, searched for months. But the theft ring was sophisticated. They moved horses quickly, across state lines. Probably sold her to someone who either didn't know or didn't care about her value. The abuse she must have suffered." The man's voice broke. "To see her reduced to what she must have been when you bought her, it's unforgivable." Arthur's mind raced, calculating implications. Recognizing that this conversation was heading toward territory he'd been trying not to contemplate, but which had probably been inevitable from the moment Duchess had revealed capabilities that seemed beyond what a broken rescue horse should possess. "She saved my life last week," Arthur said, needing the man to understand. "There was a flood. I got trapped under my tractor. She broke down her stall door and pulled me free. Nobody else could have done that. She's the reason I'm standing here." The man nodded slowly. "That's what champions do. That's what she was bred for, pulling impossible weights, persisting when other horses would quit. She's worth easily $100,000, Mr. Bennett, Arthur Bennett. Mr. Bennett, I want to buy her back. I'll pay you whatever you think is fair. Name your price." Arthur looked at Duchess, who had stopped grazing and was watching him with those deep brown eyes that had first compelled him to bid at an auction when he had no business bidding on anything. He thought about what $100,000 would mean, The farm saved, the bank paid off. Enough money to restart operations properly, to repair equipment, to buy seed for next year's planting. He thought about 3 months of eating rice so Duchess could have hay, about soaking her leg every night, about watching her transform from something the world had marked as worthless into this powerful creature who'd proven everyone wrong. He thought about her standing over him on the porch, keeping him warm until help arrived, about her refusing to quit, even when pulling weight that should have been impossible to move. "No," Arthur said. The man blinked, surprised. "No, Mr. Bennett, I'm offering you a life-changing amount of money. You could rebuild your farm, live comfortably. Isn't that worth—" "She didn't pull me out of that flood because I owned her," Arthur interrupted. "She did it because we're family, because I took care of her when nobody else would, because she knows I chose her even when choosing her was stupid and financially disastrous, and everyone told me I was wasting my time on a broken animal." Arthur moved toward Duchess, his crutches awkward on the uneven ground, and she met him at the fence, her nose pushing gently against his chest, her breath warm and steady. He rested his hand on her face, feeling the solid reality of her, this creature that had somehow become the center of his world, despite all practical considerations, suggesting she should have been abandoned to whatever fate the auction had determined. "You can't put a price on family," Arthur continued. "Can't put a price on loyalty like that. She's not for sale. She's not going anywhere. I don't care if that makes me stupid or crazy or financially irresponsible. She's mine and I'm hers, and that's all that matters." The man was quiet for a long moment, his expression cycling through disbelief and respect and something that might have been envy. "You really love her?" "I really do." "Even knowing what you're giving up?" "Especially knowing that. Money comes and goes. Banks take farms. Droughts end crops. But what Duchess and I have, that's real. That's something nobody can take unless I let them. And I'm not letting them." The man nodded slowly, accepting, his initial purpose defeated, but his respect for Arthur evident. "Would you at least accept payment for her care, for what you've spent nursing her back to health? I can't take her, but I can compensate you for what you've done for her." Arthur considered this, pride warring with practicality, his need to reject charity battling against the reality that accepting help wasn't the same as accepting defeat. "I'd accept a fair price for 3 months of care and rehabilitation, not as payment, as acknowledgement." They settled on a figure, enough to give Arthur breathing room, to buy time with the bank, to make the farm viable for at least another season. Not a fortune, but sufficient. More importantly, it came with respect rather than pity, with recognition that Arthur had done something valuable in saving Duchess, even if he'd done it for reasons that had nothing to do with her monetary worth. The man left as the sun was setting, his expensive car disappearing down the dirt road, leaving Arthur alone with Duchess in the golden light that made everything look like it might be okay, even when reality suggested otherwise. Arthur stood at the fence, watching Duchess graze, thinking about how 3 months ago he'd been drowning in despair and debt, and the absolute certainty that nothing in his life would ever improve. Thinking about how a broken horse that everyone else saw as worthless had somehow become the thing that made him want to keep trying, keep working, keep believing that tomorrow might be different from today. "We're family," he told her, speaking words she couldn't understand, but which needed saying anyway. "You and me, broken things together. But maybe being broken doesn't mean being worthless. Maybe it just means we understand each other better than people who've never had to rebuild themselves from nothing." Duchess lifted her head, water from the trough dripping from her muzzle, her eyes meeting Arthur's, with the same recognition that had passed between them in the auction barn. Two damaged souls recognizing kinship, acknowledging that survival sometimes required finding someone else who understood what it meant to be written off, and deciding to prove everyone wrong together. The farm was still struggling. The drought wasn't over. The bank still wanted its money. But Arthur had Duchess, and Duchess had Arthur, and they'd saved each other in ways that went beyond physical rescue into territory, where broken things found purpose in caring for other broken things. That was worth more than $100,000, worth more than financial security or social acceptance or any of the things people typically measured value by. It was worth everything.